Hi guys, welcome to Studio Wildlife. In today's video I thought I'd do something a little bit different and I would create... Hi guys, welcome to StudioWildlife.com. Hi guys, welcome to Studio Wildlife. In today's video I thought I'd do something a little bit different and critique some of your work. So these improvements and these critiques and these suggestions are just suggestions. They're things that I personally would do to try and alter these pieces. They aren't the right thing to do, they aren't the wrong thing to do. You've just got to make your own decision about what you think is right and wrong. I'm just going to suggest some of my improvements. I really hope I don't offend any of you because that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to offer some constructive criticism and help you grow as an artist and help me grow as an artist and a YouTuber and a teacher. So I hope you enjoy the video and let's get started with it. So I've uploaded a few pieces to my iPad to have a look at. I've had a little play around. So let's start with this one here. So what we've got is an overview of, or a big drawing of a leopard. And for me, this looks a little bit washed out. So first of all, when I'm painting this, I would really think a little bit more about my highlights and my shadows, and I'd just play around a little bit at making everything just that little bit more contrasting and a little bit darker. Let's have a quick play around with the colours. Okay, so for this one I probably wouldn't have that red so red. Let's try and tone that down a little bit. Let's leave it in. Anyway, that red wouldn't be so red where I'd have it. But for me, this picture, one of two things needs to happen. Either we need to darken the background and add some highlights to our leopard, or we need to darken our leopard to separate it from that background a little bit. And I've already done that a little bit with just my editing. But for me, doing this piece, everything just looked a little bit washed out. Everything just looked a little bit the same. There was no difference between the leopard itself and the background. And just darkening that off a little bit will give that little bit of depth. It will allow us to focus on the main part of this drawing, which is the leopard. So if we have a look at this leopard's face is actually kind of flat. I'm not really liking the face. The body is good because we've got all these areas of shadow down here. Got this shadowy area, got shadow here. We're starting to get that depth and that little bit of form that makes wildlife pictures look more realistic. Okay, so we've got some of those shadows, we've got some of that form, we've got some of that shape that we need. Okay, but the face, if we actually look at the face, I know it's a rubbish picture or photograph, but the face looks a little bit flat. So we need some of that depth in there as well. We need some of those shadows and those highlights just to give it that little bit of form as well. Obviously I don't have the reference picture that was used for this, so I am just making up where these shadows and highlights would go. I am by no means an expert on animal anatomy, so it will look off. Okay. And then let's just add that to a multiply layer. Okay, so you can see already we've sort of added to this a little bit. We've given it a little bit more dimension and a bit of depth. The next thing that I would probably do for this painting is adjust this background a little bit. I like to make sure that part of my background is darker. So for me, I would darken off this part of the background a little bit. Okay, give it a sense of mystery as to where it's walking into. Let me just blur that out a little bit. Okay, and then I would probably add next a little bit of a lighter area over on this side of the face. So let's do that with a nice bright yellow where I would want some of that light to hit. Okay, again, this is just me playing around. I don't actually know this is where the light would hit. I'm just making it up as I go along. Okay, and let's set that to an overlay. You could do this effect that I'm doing here really easily just with thin washes and glazes of paint. Right, and then just with a little sketching brush on a new layer, I tend to add a really bright light showing that it's backlit. So for me, I would probably do something like this, just to give it that little bit of extra depth and dimension. Might even, rather than grey, let's just change that to a slightly different colour. Let's try and brighten up a little bit. And let's tone these down a little bit. But it just adds a little bit of depth and dimension to a piece if you separate it from the background a little bit more by making one area a bit lighter, one area a bit darker, and where a dark region of an animal is, use that light, use that difference in the values to create the edges. Rather than drawing lines, create edges with your tonal values. Okay, the next one is this little robin. I think it's a robin. Yep, dusky robin. And this is really well painted. Okay, from what I can see, it's really good. I really like the effect that you've got here where you've left some of the letters showing through. Really, really like that. Of course, if you didn't want that effect of those letters showing through, you could always prime your drawing area or your painting area first with a little bit of gesso or white paint to get rid of those letters showing through, but I really like that. You don't really have to do this for this picture. For me, you've got the shadow areas, you've got that brilliantly. You just need to add a clear area of light because you've got your shadow, you've got your mid values over here, but you've not yet got that clear area of light. So I would just add that in like this on the robin, over here, and on the tree down here. Your tree was looking a little bit flat before. You've put all this detail into your robin, but not as much detail into your tree. And it's not necessarily about the detail in the tree that makes it important, but it just looks a bit flat. It doesn't look as 3D as your robin. So to make it look a little bit more 3D, it's just about adding those lights and those shadows. So all I've done is add a little bit of shadow here. And let me see if I can draw that in with a different colour. Okay, so shadow there. And then I've just added some light here and here, just to give it a little bit of form. So if we take these off, you can see the light being added, you can see the shadows being added, and it just really gives it a bit more form and a bit more of a 3D structure, which is exactly what you want for your wildlife pictures. Okay, so if we move to our next one, let's have a look, let's see what we've got. So we've got this swan here. So this looks like it is a painting on canvas, and a couple of little things here. The swan, the lighting on the neck of the swan is really good, but you just seem to have lost that lighting on its body. So for me, one of the first things that I would do to improve this is just add a touch more of that nice lighting effect. You've done it underneath, you've done it in the reflections, but not on the body of the actual swan. So just add that nice bit of shadow. Another thing that I've noticed is it looks like there's more detail in the reflection than there is in the actual swan at the top. And I know that this might have been a crystal clear, gin smooth lake with no reflections at all, but if you are doing a reflection, if you're wanting to do something like this, I do advise adding a little bit of distortion to the piece, not making it as detailed as the actual bird that is sat on top of the water. So if we just select this and we just knock back some of that detail. Okay, and then because it's water, and there will be some disturbance in that water, there always will be. Let's just add a few little... that is why it's not working. And let's just add a bit of disturbance to it, showing that there is actually some light on the surface as well, and not just perfectly clear water. Okay, and then after doing that, you could leave it as this, or you could just, if you look at water in a little bit more detail, you do tend to find that there are little sort of specks or imperfections in it. You could just add those over the top. I mean, I am not using a reference photo, so I'm not very good. Water is one of my least favourite things to paint and draw. I am terrible at water, but if we just give the impression of some light going over the surface of this, and as this swan is moving through the water, unless it's sitting perfectly still, it would be creating some ripples. Okay, if you do this with oil paint, you could always paint in your main swan, block in the swan underneath, and then smudge it with a brush. Otherwise, you could paint it or draw it however you want, but make sure to add in that distortion, make sure to add in that surface of water as well. Let's see what else we have. So here we've got a very, very textured orangutan, which is a really good piece. I really like the texture, but again, it would have been nice if it just popped out a little bit more, if you'd focused on the form in a little bit more detail. So for me, again, what I would like to see are a few more shadows and a few more highlights. This just looks very flat, a very flat image to me. I want that face here, I want this part of its face, and I want these cheek extension things really popping out at you. I want them looking 3D and coming out of the page. I want his chin clearly separated from the rest of his body. Right, and you can do this really easily just by glazing over the top of your piece. Right, same thing, I want highlights. Make sure you've got clear highlights. That doesn't mean pure white. It just means make sure you've got an established area of light. That could be a very poor bit of light, but at least it's clear as to where that light source is actually coming from. Right, and then if you're going for an abstract piece, really make it abstract, because a lot of the marks you're making are the same marks. You're making tree-like bark here with your scratching, your brush strokes here for the fur, they're very, very similar. The splatters that you're doing here, you are abstracting it up, but you don't have any reason for your abstracting. You're just trying something new, which is great, but make sure you have a deliberate use or a deliberate idea in your mind when you're creating these abstract shapes. So think about the underlying form, about what you're trying to create when you're adding these abstract marks, rather than just adding these splashes to the hopes that they'll make your piece look interesting. I mean, for me, I am going to go against that slightly. I would like to see a bit more variation to what you're doing. So I would like to see some of this nice bright orange that we've got over here. I would like to see that somewhere else in this picture. So like, throw some paint down, splash it about. Don't be scared to get your piece a little bit dirty. Don't be scared to throw things about and cover it. You can always wipe it off if you wait between layers. Maybe go a little bit brighter. Get an ink roller or a squeegee or a credit card and add some little extra bits. You're going for an abstract piece, so make it abstract. But don't forget that underlying shape. Don't forget that underlying form of what it is you're trying to create. And I think because we've got this shadow down here, what we need to do is lighten this area at the top a bit to really make him stand out. And again, you don't need to get rid of that texture, but you just need to glaze over with another colour. Just really make that orangutan stand out. So yeah, if it was me, that's what I'd do. So we'd go from something that looks like this to something that looks a little bit more with the shadow, a little bit more with the highlights, and a little bit more with our abstract patterns, just varying those brush strokes up a little bit. The more variation you put into the piece, the more interesting it will actually look, and the more pleasing it will be for the viewer. What else have we got? Okay, this next one is, by all accounts, a really, really nice painting. The only things that I would really do to this is add a few sort of hairs and highlights into these black areas, especially when you're painting tiger fur. There is actually fur here. By painting them completely jet black, you lose that depth, you lose that realistic look. They just look a bit flat. So by going through it and adding in some loose hairs in there, you're still giving the appearance of fur. Now this one's black and white, so you just go in with a sort of grey colour. Very thin paint, so watered down, or using a medium if you're using oil paints. But if I was to do this on a coloured painting, I would be adding some blues in there, some browns in there, especially where that light is hitting, just to give that appearance of fur in those black stripes, because they are covered in fur. They're not just dark black stripes, so make sure you paint them as actual fur rather than just black voids of nothingness. For this one as well, the only other improvement really that I could pick up from is just have an idea of where your light is coming from. This doesn't really have a clear sense of light direction for me. This area here, let me just get a better pen. For me, this looks very similar to a piece I've seen before, and it could be a very backlit piece with all of this area here being lit up, right? And then this area here in shadow. And then, but for me, this piece doesn't actually show that very well. If you look, this area here, so this area here and this area here, they both have very similar looks to them. So this area and this area. There's no real definition or distinguishing between those shadows. For me, I would just go ahead and add a little glaze just at this edge here, just above the ear and just near the base of the nose, just to really distinguish between those two areas and give it that sense of depth a little bit more. But other than that, it is a fantastic picture. Your fur looks really good. If not a little bit straight, just tweak the direction a little bit with your fur, because they're all, what you're doing, it seems like what you're doing is this. I'll do it really simply so we can see. It looks like the way that you're painting your fur is like this. So they're all quite straight lines, and you are varying that direction, but it's very straight. Whereas what you want to be doing is something a little bit more like this. Put one in, then another go in another direction. Okay, vary up the direction of that fur a little bit more. Okay, and it will just give that sense of depth and look a little bit closer to realistic fur. But other than that, fantastic piece. Well done. So let's zoom out a little bit so you can see the differences. So this is what it was like originally. Add a little bit extra fur in those black stripes and just get your shadows more established. Okay, let's look at this bear next. I think this looks like it's been done in charcoal, and it just looks a little bit overexposed to me. What I would prefer to see if this was one of my pieces is a little bit more detail in these highlight areas, because that's where in nature you'd see the most detail. Because if you think about it, when we see things, it's just because of the light that is bouncing off the object and reflecting into our eyes. So the areas where there is the most light, they are going to be the areas that have the most detail in them. We can actually lose some of the detail in those shadowy areas because they're less important. So for me, I would try and just lose a little bit of the detail in those shadowy areas. So everywhere that is a shadowy area in your piece, I will just lose quite a lot of that detail. Put a little bit of a darker spin on this as well, just so I can show you what I mean. So if we multiply that, make it a little bit darker, we've lost some of that detail, and then on a layer on top, I would do this with a putty eraser or a white charcoal pencil, depending on what look you were going for. Okay, I would then just want to add in, okay, everywhere where you've lost some of this detail, everywhere where there was these highlights, I could put a little bit more of a highlight in the eye, a little bit more on the nose. Now we've just lost that nice bit of detail that should have been in this. Whereas you've put your detail in your shadowy areas, really that detail wants to be in our highlighted areas. You get the general gist of it. So adding that detail in those highlighted areas rather than adding them in those shadowy areas will make a massive difference to your pictures. I would also think about what your piece is sitting in. So to make this a really finished painting and give it a little bit extra, I would think about what is actually going on around your picture. So for me, I would just add a little bit of charcoal or something here. It doesn't have to be perfect, just some abstract shapes just to darken off one area. And maybe a little bit lighter over this area, where we want some of these highlights. There you go. So for me, something like this, I'd be happy with that. I'd maybe brighten my highlights a little bit more, but for the purpose of what I was showing you, for the purpose of the thing to improve a little bit, is just add that detail in those highlights and knock back some of the detail in your shadowy areas a little bit, because they are the areas where you wouldn't see that detail in real life because there's no light reflecting from those. That's why they're shadowy areas. Okay, what else have we got here? Okay, these stags. So these are really good. Okay, there's definitely potential here. There is perfect amounts of light, perfect amounts of shadow, perfect amounts of depth there. The proportions are slightly off, I think. I think some of the legs are a little bit thin and the heads are a little bit big, but then again, deer do sometimes have funny shaped legs. They don't seem very proportionate. Where I would improve with this one is in the fur itself. It looks more like the fur has been scribbled on. So if we... I don't know if this is the way you do it, but to me this is how it looks. It looks more like the fur has been done sort of like that. Just scribbled in bits. Okay, and that, although it can look like realistic fur, and you have done an alright job with it here, it just, for me personally, it looks a little bit rushed. It looks a little bit rough. It doesn't look very professionally done. So I would just take a little bit more time with that fur, thinking about exactly where it's going, exactly which direction it's going in, why it's going in that direction. Just mixing up that fur. Make sure each stroke counts. And that doesn't mean you can't do big clumps of fur, because that's how I always start my pictures. I start with big clumps and then work smaller and smaller and finer and finer. But for me, it looks like you've just gone like this. Okay, whereas we want to be thinking more about, what's that clump of fur doing? Which part of the body is that clump of fur going over? Why is it going over that clump of fur? Which bit of muscle is underneath it? And how can I use this fur to establish the form of this deer a little bit more? Right? It's just about thinking more about those individual strands of fur as opposed to thinking about them as a whole clump. Now, I would also, I'm quite a fan of having some drawn edges in my work. It's the way that I work and the style that I go for. So I like having those abstract sort of dark lines surrounding my piece. Okay, but for yours, for the style that it is, you've not really gone for that. Yours is looking a little bit more realistic, but with a bit of more of an abstracty background. I personally would try and blend away some of these edges. I wouldn't have as harsh an edge. You've sort of got lines where you've drawn, whereas at the back, I would let the darkness of the legs and the light of the background form those edges, as opposed to drawing things. So it's just about blending those edges back a little bit and maybe not having them as harsh, almost out of focus, a bit softer, so that those heads are the main area of focus of your piece. Okay, I think I've got time for about one more. Let's look at one that I haven't done. Okay, let's talk about this tiger. So this looks like it's a coloured pencil, and I'm not very good with coloured pencil, but the first thing I would say is the paper that you're using. For me, I wouldn't ever work on a white piece of paper if I was doing coloured pencil. I would work on a toned piece of paper, similar or contrasting to the colour that I wanted my main piece to be. Just because you can see all the little crackles of white showing through in your fur, and I don't really like that appearance in my pictures. What I would say, though, is as well, for you, your shadows and your highlights are massively important, but also your proportions. So I know I said I wasn't going to do proportions, but we'll do it. So let's say we pick a nice contrasting colour here. Let's go for a blue background. Let's make this a little bit bigger, change the brush. Okay, let's have, oh, that's a bit big. Let's have a nice to this piece, as if we were working on a toned background. So you get the idea. So first of all, proportions wise, let's just have a little play with those. So for me, if I've got my proportions wrong on a painting, I will always go back and with a white charcoal pencil or a red charcoal pencil, I will just go and draw on top and correct it. So for me, I would like to see a little bit more mouth here and raise my mouth up a little bit. Okay, so for me, I'd want it going something a little bit more like that, personally. I know it's not perfect, but we're trying to fit with the theme of the piece. I would probably blend out some of the edges here a little bit more. So I would blend out some of these edges a little bit, give it a bit of a fluffier look. Okay, and again with the fur at the back, blend it into the background, make it a bit less of a straight edge, throw some loose bits of fur into that background, and again with the side of the face. Okay. Then, so for me then, I would think about the shadows. If we're just doing it very simply, there's no shadow here, there's no light here. There's nothing suggesting form or shape. So that is the first thing that we need. Some form and some shape. And same thing, we need some definite highlights as well. Now where is that light actually coming from? Where is it hitting? And for me, it looks like it's hitting over here. Okay, so I'd just give us a little bit more shape. And then, for me, you'd be much better off focusing on getting the colours correct, the form, the shape, the shadows and the highlights correct, rather than trying to go into the details. Right, so this is already starting to look a little bit more 3D, and all I've really done is added some darker areas and some lighter areas. That's all I've got time for today. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found those critiques useful for your work. If you do want me to do more critiques, please let me know in the comments. This is my first time doing it, so I'm not very good. I hopefully will get a bit better as we progress and as I do more. But thank you very much to everyone that sent me in work, and I'm sorry that I couldn't get through everyone's. Hopefully I'll do another video and I'll be able to get through your work as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed those little critiques. I'm just suggesting what I would do to improve those particular pictures. Quite a few people need to sort of focus on their proportions a little bit more and get their drawing down rather than focusing on the details. That is my big tip, really. Try and focus on getting the basic shapes correct, getting the basic proportions correct, all your perspectives correct before you actually start thinking about individual hairs. Make sure you've got that structure and that form down. Then you can work on building in and adding in that detail. You can get a really realistic piece without adding in every single tiny strand of hair. One particular really good artist that I follow on Instagram is Greg Beecham, and he uses a palette knife for all his wildlife artworks, but his pieces are incredible and incredibly realistic because of the form and the shape and the 3D nature of what he creates. He's got those colours down, he's got the structure down, he's got the form down, all without using a brush. And it's because of that that makes him a really, really good wildlife artist. He can bring a lot of life into his pictures just by looking at the colour, just by looking at the form, rather than adding loads and loads of detail. Whereas for me, I like to get in there with a fine detailed brush, but always thinking about that form, always thinking about that structure as I'm painting. That's it. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, it means so much to us. And as always, if you head over to studiowildlife.com, you can find loads more wildlife art tips for you to look at. And if there is something specific that you would like help with, please just let us know in the comments and we'll try and put a video together for you.